me the opportunity to ask a few questions as well. We have buildings in the committee, but I'm not a member of this committee, so Mr. Chairman, I thank you for that opportunity. And thank you for the granting of these hearings. Obviously, it's of great interest to a lot of people. I have just a couple of questions that I would like to put forward here right now. First, just a couple of questions to Secretary Myers, if you could, and then a couple to Mr. Williams. Mr. Myers, you mentioned that at this point, it made very clear that the department is not implementing Real ID. The decision has not been made to do so, and that's
the decision is not
ongoing.
That's correct.
Is there, though, put in a different way, are there any provisions of Real ID that the department is currently implementing, even though they might be implementing the Act itself? Are there provisions of the Act that the department is currently implementing?
There are items within the driver's license, as I mentioned earlier. As an example, we have three levels of security, which is the overt, the covert, and the forensic, which we have had for years, that are specifically mentioned in the Real ID Act. The Real ID Act requires a reasonable effort to confirm that a image that is in your database, an individual that is in the database is not there under another name. So the facial recognition would address that particular issue, I believe, although we have not specifically talked to DHS about that. So those are items as an example. We have not implemented upfront photos at this point in time. Meaning that the photo is taken first when the customer comes in, as opposed to after all of the documents have been vetted.
In regard to the photographs, you referenced that the photographs now are digitized.
Correct.
In facial recognition.
That's correct.
When did that begin? How long has the department been doing that?
1990s. I don't have a specific year, but began in 1990.
Is there any standard that is being utilized? Because in reading, there are different standards utilized for facial recognition photography. What standards are the department now utilizing in the digitized photographs that are being taken?
I'm not sure I'm clear on the question from a technology standpoint. The contractor that we use for the purposes of our software is also a contractor for other states, and so I would assume that there's some consistency in the requirements as far as the digital photo that is actually taken. I know that there are requirements as well within the Real ID Act, final regulations, and of course we'll have to look to make sure that what we do today would be in compliance with those requirements if we participated in Real ID.
From your perspective, you may not know the details of the technology of that, but are those standards that are being utilized right now by the department, are they national standards? Are they international standards, or
the standards that we use from the standpoint of someone getting their picture taken? It has to be a frontal picture, obviously, and from the standpoint of how one presents themselves from the standpoint, we need to be able to see the full face.
Is it, from the department's perspective, are the pictures that are now being taken being digitized? Would they be accurately described as biometric photographs?
It depends upon how you define biometric. I mean, they are digital photos, just as you would take in your camera that are stored electronically on a server.
And therefore would be machine readable, not human readable, from that perspective. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to compare it, so they would have to be machine readable. Just one other question, and I'm going to have some questions for Mr. Williams. You mentioned in your testimony as well about the security of this. Since the department has been collecting the higher grade photographs, are those photographs and that data, from a security perspective, maintained fully within Pennsylvania?
Yes.
Or is any of that data in that photograph it all being transferred out of Pennsylvania at the current time?
Stored out of Pennsylvania? The answer to that is no.
Well, transferred or stored?
Well, we share information, as I noted earlier, with many other jurisdictions when it comes to the issuance of driver's licenses. That can occur in two different ways. One would be the data from the standpoint of somebody have a conviction in another state. We also share with certain states, from a pilot program standpoint, digital imaging of people's pictures, so that if we have an individual who's coming in from a participating state, Virginia is one as an example, so if we have a resident from Virginia moving in to Pennsylvania, our operators are able to call that image up on our screens to see the Virginia driver's license, to verify that the person who's standing in front of them is in fact a legitimate Virginia driver's license holder, before we would go forward with issuing them a Pennsylvania driver's license. Okay. So we do that. The images, but those images are not stored anywhere. They're simply exchanged back and forth. But in the case of our images, we have our images on two servers that are in Pennsylvania. One is the primary server, the other is a redundancy.
The only reason for, I guess, asking that question is, and again, you may not have data, but the department has entered into a contract, I think, with the company that you did mention the company's name, but is working on the data and some help on that. And in the contract, it does say that the data is to be backed up off-site in another state in this company. Is that not happening then, or is the contract not?
We certainly have, as we have for years with various contractors, have a contract with a contractor who supplies the software and hardware computer equipment for the purposes of storing our data, but also actually taking the pictures. In fact, we're in the process right now of upgrading all of that equipment. Those servers that I spoke of earlier are in state, in Pennsylvania. They are part of the contractor's responsibility under their contract. They have a contract with Pennsylvania that runs from July of 2006 to December of 2013. That contract is approximately $45 million. It covers the issuance of all driver's licenses, all ID cards for that period of time.
And again, and you're stating, though, that there is no data of Pennsylvania driver's licenses being stored off-site.
That's my understanding. We also do security backup tapes, and to the best of my knowledge, those tapes are also in Pennsylvania. But I'll certainly be happy to verify that on the tapes.
I think perhaps we can discuss that further, perhaps afterwards, because I know in the contract it says that one of the provisions is that in fact the data is backed up off-site and stored.
Which it is.
So it is stored off-site?
It is definitely, as I said earlier, just for
that's why I thought you said it was not transferred.
For purposes of clarification, there are two servers. One is the primary server, one is a backup server. To your question, though, both of the servers are in Pennsylvania.
So it's not backed up off-site, out-of-state then?
There is no server that is located out of state that has the images and that information on it.
All right, thank you very much.
The question, what I will follow up with you on is the actual backup tapes, which is another security feature that we have. So, but I'll validate that for you.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I ask that any information, any response to questions that are raised that you provided to the committee, and then the committee will make sure
Absolutely.
get the information.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Williams, thank you for being here today. I don't think we've had someone from Homeland Security here. Your involvement allows the committee to get some good information from you. One of the things that my constituents and so many folks across the state and across the country have been concerned in the global sense as well as in the more personal sense, and the question was raised by Representative Joseph earlier, and that is the question of whether or not this grand expansion of real ID or ID card is in fact a national identification card, or could become a national identification card by the fact of what's in it or on it or where it goes or used or whatever. And I know you in your testimony were very clear in saying that those concerns about Real ID creating a national identification card, national database, are simply not true. From that perspective, the housing, the collecting of data and the housing of data is a concern because no one's really for sure where it goes. The idea of having a card of some type where you've got to have it in order to go somewhere and do some things with it and so forth becomes a concern for many people that it will limit their mobility in terms of the ability to perhaps just travel. And so those kind of things are very real to us. I know that that the sharing of data as well, which I asked the Secretary, is also another concern. When data is collected, where does it go? Who has access to it? How can we absolutely be sure that personal data, such as we have on our driver's licenses, which includes our social security number and gender and where we live and criminal history and a lot of other things, that data, if somebody, the wrong person gets hold of that data, then in fact we are all harmed. And I know just from a point of interest that the Robert Mockney, who is obviously high up in DHS, some time ago sketched a federal plan to extend biometric data, the photograph and digitized data, proposed extending that to Asian and European governments and corporations so as to create a global identity management system. And then there was a second quote that I had found that came as well from Mr. Mockney that said, "We are starting the process of biometrifying a good proportion of the world population." And just with that in mind, it just seems like this whole thing is becoming very large, very global from this perspective. A question that I have then for you in this regard would be this: if the card is not, or Real ID is not to establish a de facto national ID card, or it doesn't come that way, what do we call it, or how do we as legislators address this issue when Homeland Security just in December signed agreements with the governors of 3 states, including Arizona and some others, to use their enhanced Real ID compatible card as the proof of citizenship to allow movement back and forth between the border, recognized by Canada and Mexico, known as a pass card and some other things involved in that. In a case such as that, where another country will accept this identification card as entrance into their state or into their country, does it not in fact become not just a national ID card, but an international ID card? And I'm just wondering your comment on that. How do we look at it? If another country is to the point of recognizing this Real ID compliant card, is that not then in fact an international ID card?
There's a couple of issues in what you said, and the first is present some information for separation. One is when you talk about cards to facilitate cross-border travel, that's not Real ID. You're talking a different program. That's under the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, and that's called Enhanced Driver's License. The requirements for that program is really legislated, completely different than Real ID. Real ID is not a cross-border document to facilitate travel. Real ID is really a minimum set of standards that states are ends to follow so that each state will at least adhere to minimum standards before they issue a driver's license or identification card to their various citizens. Some of the reasons for this, for example, like one of the questions came up earlier, what is the benefit for Pennsylvania if Pennsylvania is actually taking a lead in improving its driver's license card and driver's license issuing process? Well, one of the things I say to many states is that the planes that went into New York and to the Twin Towers did not originate from New York. And that meaning to say that unless there's uniform standards across the entire country, any one state still leaves the rest of the country vulnerable. So therefore, the uniform standards are to ensure that we have uniformity in standards across the nation. Pennsylvania has done a number of wonderful things to improve the process, improve the card. There are many such states who have not. Those states still make your state and your citizens vulnerable to ID theft and other illegal type activities that Real ID seeks to reduce or eliminate. Getting back to cross-border now, the EDL Enhanced Driver's License is a different program now in Arizona and New York and Washington State and Vermont. They are taking a look at a combination of documents. One is a Real ID compliant credential combined with the enhanced driver's license features. So we'll have one document that can facilitate two different forms of ID. One for example, to board aircraft, interfederal facilities, or nuclear power plants, which is the Real ID requirements. The other is to facilitate cross-border travel with an enhanced capability, which is really an RFID chip to facilitate coming across the border much quicker. Now, some states are looking at it, they would like to combine both. That is a state's choice. Many states do not see the market for such a combination of documents. And for those states, they may opt to have Real ID only without the enhanced driver's license feature. But again, those are two different programs administered by different individuals and really set forth by different laws.
Clarify then for me, if you could, is then the Real ID, are biometrics, the elements that goes into it, are biometrics then a part of Real ID, or are they not a part of Real ID?
And the only entities that the rule or the law talks about that would be construed as a biometric for Real ID would be the signature and a photograph. Other than that, there are no biometric requirements for Real ID.
Okay, would you explain what the photograph is then? What is biometric about the photograph and in that part of it? And what?
I'm just suggesting Real ID requires a digital photograph.
And does it have to meet any kind of a standard, or is it just a digital photograph?
And really, when Mr. Myers spoke earlier all about the full frontal facial view, that's pretty much what Real ID requires. It's an unobstructed view of an individual's face without their head garb that would come down so far as to be able to disguise the individual's image. So for law enforcement purposes, if by chance an individual stopped, that individual can be ascertained that person's identity, but also for any place that that person will want to gain entry to, for whomever the taker of that identification credential is at the time, a checker, for example, at an airport, for them to establish that the picture on this document does in fact match the person in the picture so they can verify identity.
So in that degree, I mean, there are terminologies of face mapping, the aspect of that a person's photograph is taken with the plots around it, so that in fact what ends up is really the biometric image of that person as is accurate perhaps as that person's DNA or that person's fingerprint. Is the photograph that Real ID anticipates, or Homeland Security anticipates in that regard, is it of that distinct quality that it is in fact that person's image as would be that, and distinctively theirs as would be a DNA or a fingerprint? Is it that
I'm certainly
quality?
not a technical expert in regards to photography, at least to the dimension that you're speaking, but I will not use the term face mapping. I would not use any technical terms beyond what I've suggested, and that is a full view of the person's face.
Okay, and I have to jump in here because we don't want to
Mr. Chairman,
make our city council chambers all day.
Can I just conclude this one point if I can, then I'll go on. I just want to conclude this. Reason for asking the question, Mr. Chairman, and some of these is that I think a lot of the concern that we all share is that as we get into this from a state level, having to deal with it, and having to answer our constituents, and understand what's going on, there is a lot that seems to unfold itself and kind of reveal a new revelation as it comes along. And there are aspects of it that are frankly troubling from the standpoint that we don't really know all that's there. And the reason, Mr. Chairman, if you bear with me this one here, the reason for asking that question is that I did see in some cross-referencing in the Federal Register and the NPRM rules laid out in regard to Real ID. It says that DHS is proposing, which this stands. This stands. This is it. Was not changed by the new regs. Is proposing that digital photographs comply with current ICAO standards, which is the International Civil Aviation Organization, and that those standards include certain things. And then in a footnote, it says the footnote, the relevant ICAO standard is ICAO 9303, Part 1, Volume 2, specifically, and it goes on safety things, information technology, biometric data interchange formats, and then it lays that out. That is the standard, international standard for biometric photograph and data collection. And that was my question for asking, because that is international. And my question earlier about whether or not a ID card being used to allow access to another country, in fact, becomes an international ID card. And I know you stated that Real ID is not that card. What I'm saying is that the technology, which is the picture, is international and is in our own Federal Register that's a part of this law. I look at that and I say, I have questions about that part of trying to fit those pieces together.
And I think you've raised a very good point which we will be taking up, and I don't want people to forget that we will be in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Scranton, Erie before this is over with. So we will explore these issues in much more detail. Thank you. Representative Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, Mr. Williams. I guess I'll start off with the old adage, a little bit of knowledge is dangerous, or very little knowledge, I may be very dangerous. I have some knowledge of the, and let me start out by saying, after 9/11, I know things must change, and this is nationally what we have to do to protect ourselves. So we'll start out down that road. But I have some knowledge of the TWIC program, the Transportation Workers Identification Card, and I know that we had a lot of trouble with that. It started to stop 3 times. So I just want to know, is there any coordination between the Real ID and TWIC, which will, you can find out some of the problems with the TWIC and then maybe head them off with the Real ID?
The answer to your question is yes. We've got back at DHS what we call a screening coordination office. And all the credentials that DHS is either putting out rules for or following up on in regards to identification technology is shared across that entire spectrum of all the identification programs. So the TWIC program manager, the waiting program manager, me being the Real ID program manager, we do communicate every Friday from 10 until about 12 o'clock. We exchange information to make sure that we've got consistency of implementation, but also lessons learned. So the answer to the question is yes.
And my other question, the TWIC card, I believe, right as of now, costs $140. How does that change from the $8 that you're projecting for the real ID and the TWIC card, which probably isn't much different, and the $140 that it costs for a TWIC card?
Okay, can't attest to the components of cost for the TWIC card, but for the real ID card, again, as we've taken a look at, as we've done the economic analysis, citing the amount of driver's license issuances over an approximately 11-year period of time, that total cost is what we're talking about in regards to, if you average it out over the total reissuance process between 2008 and roughly about December 2017, it totals out at about $8.31 per card is exactly what it totals out to be, which for here is roughly about $2 if you average it across the board.
Is that because of the fund that's subsidizing the cost?
No, that's just based upon the total program cost divided by the amount of issuances that will be accorded over that 11-year period of time.
So I'll have to get to the TWIC manager to find out why we're paying so much for the transportation workers' comp.
And then for here, that's the added cost, approximately $2 per added cost to a driver's license already issued. So it's not the total cost of the card. It's just the added average out over the 56 jurisdiction territories. And the reason I say 56, 50 states, the District of Columbia, and the territories total out to 56. So if you total up that entire driving license population and identification card population with the amount of issuances, and some will be renewed over that period of time, that's where the total actually comes from.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Gillespie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the interest of time, I just have a couple of other questions I'd like to maybe follow up in a letter format to Mr. Myers and Mr. Williams, and I'm sure their responses back to the committee.
Okay, and can you make sure that Representative Stout and myself have
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Stout.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of questions. First of all, in the interim benchmarks that are outlined, there are 18 interim benchmarks which Pennsylvania will have to comply with in this extension period. Is there a time frame within which any one of those benchmarks must be complied with?
The time frame for all 18 is prior to December 31st, 2009. Because lead time away from that is where you must actually apply for certification to be materially compliant with the Real ID Act.
And can you tell me if, of those 18 benchmarks, does Pennsylvania already comply with any number of those?
Yes, we do. In fact, I believe the number is that we comply with 11 of the 18.
Okay, so we really only have 7 more benchmarks to move on. Okay, thank you. The next question is, on this cross-border card that you described, am I correct that the cross-border identification card is voluntary for an individual to acquire in order to enable them to move across the border unless the state decides to incorporate those standards with the Real ID standard?
Well, the card will be voluntary, yes. For Real ID also it will be voluntary. The requirements for the card are slightly different than Real ID. For example, for the EDL card, which is the card we're talking about, Enhanced Driver's License, you must be a U.S. citizen to ask for that card. Of course, you'll have to meet the certification requirements of the state issuing the card.
Okay. Next question goes to, you gave us an entire list, about 9 reasons why security was so important to Real ID and how you believe you'd manage the security issues involved. Did the federal law provide for any penalties, either federal, or does it allow the states to impose penalties for violation of these security standards?
Well, we will have a compliance audit, and each state will be audited in an integral period of time. And right now, we've got that identified as approximately every 3 years. We'll come in, we'll take a look at how well a state complies with all the standards of Real ID, to include the privacy and protection of information. And there's no such penalty, financial penalty, if that's what you're asking for, that we will levy upon the state. However, we will look at that particular point in time as whether or not that state does still in fact certify to be Real ID compliant.
So there are no criminal penalties attached to the violation of any one of these standards?
For the state, no.
And last question is, could you just describe for us, in your opinion, how does Real ID enhance the state's ability and the federal ability to identify illegal aliens?
Well,
Or if it does enhance it?
one of the things that Real ID requires is, before you can actually be issued a Real ID compliant document, is you must verify lawful presence in the United States. And that must be done electronically, which is through our SAVE, which is a Systematic Alien Verification of Entitlements program. So for those individuals who are not lawfully here, who cannot produce the documentation that verifies they're lawfully here, they of course could not have a Real ID compliant driver's license or identification card.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Melvin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to return to my previous theme of just working through the rationale for why the state would choose to opt into the federal ID, Real ID program. And I agree with our presenters that there is certainly a lot of misinformation out there about when the Real ID license must be used and for what purposes. On the other hand, I can't help but think this really seems to come down to having this Real ID program in place for Board of Claims. Most Americans are never going to go to a nuclear facility. Most Americans are going to go to a federal facility maybe once or twice in their lives, just as a general parameter. So 99% of this is really geared at the commercial airline function of Real ID. Why is it that we can't continue with the present system, maybe with certain security enhancements that would achieve that same purpose? That really seems to be the one end purpose of Real ID.
Well, let's say a couple of things. Of course, gaining access to commercial aircraft would be one. However, the other is, and really probably more importantly, is you'll have a document that verifies that you are who you say you are with a high degree of confidence, not just to board a commercial aircraft, but anywhere you take that document. If you think about it today, your driver's license basically is your passport to move throughout the country. If you look at the 19 terrorists, long before they boarded a commercial aircraft, they used identification cards to move throughout the entire U.S. landscape to check into various hotels and out, rental cars. So all the equipment, all the tools that they require to help facilitate boarding that aircraft or any other destructive ideas they had in mind, you know, those licenses, driver's license or ID card, was really their facilitating tool. The other thing it'll help do, in regards to, and these are some of the, I guess, the residual benefits. For example, right now, if you look at teenage driving, teenage underage drinking, you know, Real ID at higher standards will help to reduce that. If you look at individuals that fraudulently use identification cards for ID theft, Real ID will help reduce that. If you look at individuals, a number of people today use deceased individuals' social security numbers to establish an identity, you know, in a person's name who's deceased, and in some cases in a very short period of time, to do harm, financial harm, to those individuals' family. Real ID will help deter that. So there's a number of added benefits, to include the one thing that a state cannot do for itself is, you know, Pennsylvania can take a number of steps for its citizens within the borders of Pennsylvania. But in regards to citizens from other states, Pennsylvania, regardless of how good your credential is, will not adjudicate what those individuals can and cannot do. However, they can bring a driver's license into the state of Pennsylvania, and it will be honored just like a Pennsylvania driver's license would be. So as we take a look at putting out a uniform standard across the nation, is that way when a person comes from another jurisdiction, you'll have a reasonable idea that they are who they say they are because they've got a more secure credential.
And just working on the arguments in favor of the national security implications for this, which certainly is the strongest argument that one could put out for it. We know that within our system of federalism, it's certainly the federal government that has foremost responsibility for the national security of this country. And if this is a national security issue, why would the federal government not be funding this as part of the national war on terror?
Please don't take this to be a curt answer. You'll have to ask Congress that question. Because really, Congress are the funders of these programs. Now, we have, and a number of states have as well, gone back to Congress asking for additional funds to help implement Real ID. But Congress is the ultimate decision maker in regards to how much funding will actually be provided.
Thank you.
Couple questions. Going back to this question of airlines being unable to board planes. Within that scenario, aren't we also talking about Social Security Administration? Are we also talking about the United States Department of Health and Human Services and other federal agencies?
So you look at the Real ID Act of 2005, those entities are not called out by name. Now, is there some thought that once Real ID is implemented and we have more confidence in the credentials that individuals will have because it's Real ID, it's been electronically verified through a Social Security number to verify that the Social Security number, name, date of birth does match, because it's been verified that the person is in fact lawfully present in the U.S. It's been verified that the birth certificate that person used to get a driver's license was electronically verified. Do we think that more institutions will later on suggest that we have more confidence in this Real ID document versus some of the other documents that people bring to it? I think the answer probably would be yes, but there's no requirement explicitly in the law or the rule that states that those organizations will require Real ID.
But doesn't the rule talk about federal facilities?
It does talk about federal facilities, but it's those facilities that require a form of identification. Many federal facilities today you can get in without any identification whatsoever. So it's not suggesting all federal facilities should immediately incorporate Real ID or the requirement to show a driver's license to enter. It's just saying that in those facilities that do, if you choose to show a driver's license versus any other document accepted by that facility, it must be Real ID compliant.
My second question would run to delayed birth certificates. I've had a number of people in my office who were born in the Old South at a time where they did not have Bureau of Vital Statistics. And at least to my knowledge, the only agency that is in a position to provide a delayed birth certificate would be the United States Census Bureau. And looking at some records, but even with the Census Bureau, there can be some problems. So my question is has the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation and or the Department of Homeland Security taken this into consideration when looking at the whole credentialing aspect of Real ID?
Yes, we have, in two ways. One is the final rule suggests that anyone born before 1935 could be exempted from the birth certificate requirement. The other is an exceptions process, that a state, if there's an unusual scenario that state experiences, they can write an exceptions process to Homeland Security and say, here's our unique condition or circumstance or situation. We will take that into consideration, because the overall principle here is to have states included. It's not to look for mechanisms to exclude states, but to include states by taking a look at some of the exceptions that's unique to those jurisdictions, and then working with those jurisdictions to take a look at how to include their individuals. Because again, the thought is if we can raise the bar of security across the entire national spectrum, that's exactly what we're trying to do.
Third question is, we will be electing a chief executive officer for the United States we'll be swearing somebody in on January 20th. Is it possible that a new president can look at the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission and basically say, I understand what it is that you want. I just think that the act that is, as it is currently, implementation is currently conceived, is not what we want to do, and make some recommendations?
personnel, you look at Real ID, it was passed in Congress in 2005. So really, it is a law passed by Congress. What the next legislator may or may not do, I really don't know. We don't anticipate Real ID will go away because we anticipate that the national security requirement for a more secure identification process across the entire U.S. landscape, it will still be present regardless of who the next president will be, or regardless of what the next body, congressional body will be. The requirement will still be there.
And here's one of the reasons I asked that, is because it's my understanding that the state of New Jersey has maintained that their credentialing for driver's ID might be greater than real ID. And therefore, they should not have to go find the money or go through a lot of unnecessary barriers to comply with Real ID when the standards that they currently utilize might be greater than the standards articulated by the Real ID Act. And so, I'm asking whether a subsequent Congress or subsequent president can basically say that I see what New Jersey has done, I see what Pennsylvania is doing, and we're satisfied, so we should not strongly require that they comply with Real ID.
And actually, I think those are really excellent points because there are a number of states that will have security issuance processes and cards far beyond what Real ID requires. What Real ID sets are minimum standards that all states must comply with. So if the state of New Jersey or Pennsylvania or any other state, for example, and there are a number of states who fit in this category, if they have raised the bar of security higher than what Real ID requires, we certainly applaud those individuals. However, we still want to make sure we do have commonality, consistency, and interoperability across the U.S. landscape so that if an individual from California showed up at a DMV in New Jersey, that person could in fact be verified that they are who they claim to be before New Jersey issued a driver's license or identification card, unless there's that connectivity between not just those two jurisdictions, but multiple jurisdictions, then that verification process would not occur.
But without that exemption, in our particular case with Deputy Secretary Myers, the Secretary of PennDOT and the executive branch now must run around and try to figure out how to get extra dollars to comply with something that might be greater than what Real ID is calling for. And so there should be, and some have suggested, that the regulation should allow for an automatic waiver or exemption to states like Pennsylvania or New Jersey who are already operating on standards greater than Real ID, and so that the minimum standards would only be necessary for those states that have not taken any steps to comply with Real ID. And I think without that kind of an exception, because I really haven't heard how Real ID fits into 504, Section 504, the Disability Act, nor have, and in Pennsylvania we had this unique situation where we're second only to Florida with our elderly population, and some counties might have elderly population greater than the state of Florida. And so to that end, some have suggested that the law needs to recognize that some states have taken giant steps and should be applauded rather than penalized without financial consequences for non-compliance.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. If you take a look at two things. One is if you take a look at the final rule, it takes into consideration the NPRM was far more restrictive in nature than the final rule. The final rule allows for a tremendous amount of flexibility. So for those states that have taken progressive steps on their own dime to improve their process, to improve their credential, to do security checks within it takes that into consideration. So the funds that they've invested is certainly accounted for. The other thing is we take a look at Real ID, not just as it was envisioned in 2005. If you look at what states have done since the late 1990s, states have started to progressively improve their processes, improve security, because what Real ID stands for, states have recognized long before 2001. They knew about the lapses in security. They knew about the vulnerabilities of the card. One of the things that state DMVs could not do in many cases was obtain the resources to improve their processes, to improve security. For example, if we take a look at fraudulent identification card processes, a number of fraudulent IDs occur within the DMV. Not necessarily fraudsters outside of the DMV, but inside of the DMV. DMV commissioners and directors have known about these problems for quite some time. So as we took a look at writing the final rule, we took that information into consideration. For example, the Association of American Motor Vehicle Administrators, who's really been around since 1933, who's written a lot in regards to highway safety and how to improve safety and driver's license issuance processes. We've taken a lot of comments from them. We had 21,000 comments in regards to Real ID. A lot of those comments we categorized into 300 substantive comments, changed the rules significantly from what it was based upon not only ANVA, but other states, Pennsylvania as well, to make it a more implementable document to take into consideration the investment states have already made. So the comments you're making, we did take those into consideration, so states are not penalized for prior investments.
So we can tell Pennsylvania to go forward with AI without having to comply with Real ID, since their standards might be greater than the minimum standards required by.
I still think Pennsylvania would still want to be interconnected with other jurisdictions to verify that when people enter Pennsylvania, that they are in fact who they say they are. I still think, like, for example, when you take a look at Plot, Pennsylvania for fraudulent, the document, not fraudulent, but the program that you got in regards to facial recognition technology. There are a number of states on their own accord who are doing that. I visited North Carolina about 3 or 4 weeks ago. In North Carolina, they showed me their database where they had one individual with 43 different driver's licenses in that state. The only way they detected that individual was through their facial recognition technology. But the other thing I suggest, not only do they believe that that individual had 43 documents within the state of North Carolina, they believe that individual had licenses from South Carolina, licenses from Georgia, and licenses from Florida. Their problem was they could not detect with those states because they didn't have either a national unifying program or effort or an exchange. I would suspect that the same thing occurs in the state of Pennsylvania, where you've got a number of people here, as well as other states. Every state I've gone to, and believe I've gone to many over the last 6 months, tell me the same thing over and over and over again. To make this work, we need a unified system of capability where information can be shared to identify these fraudsters, and these individuals who really prey upon us with identification theft.
Thank you, Mr. Williams, and I guess one last question for committee members. It's my understanding that compliance or responding to the regulations is not relevant until the regulations are published. And so to that end, I'd like to ask, when do you think the regulations will be published in the Federal Register?
Right now, the date should be January 29th. And of course, it'll be a 60-day period after that before it actually becomes officially approved.
So we're looking at maybe March.
For approval, yes.
Okay. All right, let me thank
Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman, can I ask one question, please, sir? It's relevant to the issue, Pennsylvania included.
one quick question.
Thank you, sir.
The question might require us to follow up.
Yes, sir.
This week.
I'll do it quickly, sir. Mr. Williams, is it not true that in the final rules of the
Will you please identify yourself?
Yes, sir. My name is Mark Vernon.
Go to like a mic, Tim.
Yes. Mr. Williams, is it not true in the final rules that
Wait a minute,
AMBA
who
is
are
mentioned?
you?
Mark Berner.
And
Yes, sir.
you're with who?
Stop Real ID Coalition.
Okay.
Is it not true, sir, in the final rules, AMBA is mentioned 150 times? Currently, almost all states belong to what is known as the DLC, including Pennsylvania, the Driver's License Compact. Is it not true now that AMBA is proposing that states join the DLA, the Driver's License Agreement? One of the major differences between the DLC and the DLA is the DLA has provisions in it that would allow Mexico and Canada to participate in the sharing of information.
Okay, for any AMBA-related questions about what they're soliciting for DLA membership or DLC, you'll have to address that with AMBA. I cannot answer for AMBA.
What federal authority or what authority does the federal government have, though, to control what AMBA does? Does the federal government have any authority?
No, AMBA is a private organization, so no.
That's
I
my
have no control
point.
over
The
AMBA.
Real ID Act, in fact, is being turned over to AMBA. AMBA is being called the backbone, and AMBA, like the ICAO, is in fact an international organization.
Okay, but of course, I'm guessing you do know that AMBA is made up by the states and state representation. So all the states participate in AMBA and are state members. So the board of directors for AMBA is really made up by the states, the state DMVs.
Is it not true that?
Wait a minute.
With regard to the state of Pennsylvania?
You asked the question, you answered the question, we're going to have to move on.
Okay.
I saw one other question.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. Will you please
Please
allow...
identify yourself.
My name is Ralph Johns. I'm from Southern Chester County. Southern Lancaster County. I'm here today to give quick testimony because I know everybody's time is very important. We're looking at something called rights versus privileges. And according to the U.S. Constitution and the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, rights are prior to government. A government cannot give you a right. The only thing a government can do is give you a privilege, because anything and everything that a government gives you, it can and will take away. The job and function and purpose and intent of government is to protect the rights of we the people. And early I heard testimony about constitutional rights. Unfortunately, there is no such thing. The United States Constitution is a document pertaining to law, our great republic. And their government law cannot give you a right. The only thing it can do is give you a privilege. So there's no such thing as a constitutional right. And I do not intend to badger anybody, and please do not take anything I say personally. This is just business, and it's business as of we, the people. And a lot of times I hear the United States. Part of the problem is it is not the United States. I am not a citizen of the United States. I am a citizen of the sovereign Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It is we, the people. We are a federal government. It is these United States. If it is the United States, it is a national government. We are not a national government. We are made up of commonwealths and states, which are sovereign. And the main thing for our state and local representatives, and mainly the state and the Senate, is to keep the federal government at bay, to protect us from the unnecessary government. And part of the problem is government is a necessary evil. And this evil is a servant. It is a fearful servant. And we will use fire as an example. I have a firebox, and the fire is contained in the box. I can warm myself, I can warm my house, I can cook my food. But if I let this servant, this fearful servant, out of the firebox, it will become my fearful master and consume my very flesh and destroy me.
Okay.
This particular right that we're talking about is the right of liberty, the right to travel. Do not surrender this right by default. We're discussing all kinds of different subject matter here, and if we look at it, we shouldn't even be discussing this with the federal government. They have no authority to come in here and try to control my right to travel. I am a citizen of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, not the United States. I am part of we, the people.
Well, let me thank you for your comments. Let me also thank my committee members, because they are the ones who believe that we need to get the information out, and hopefully once the information is out, we can then take a correct position with respect to it. We have one more presenter, and it's almost 1 o'clock. Let me thank Mr. Williams. Let me thank Deputy Secretary Myers, and let me ask that please make note that in February we will be in Philadelphia, March we will be in Pittsburgh and Scranton, and in May we will be in Erie, Pennsylvania. Would love to have you two gentlemen back. Thank you. Our last presenter is Mr. Jeremy Meadows, who is the Senior Policy Director for the National Conference of State Legislators. Mr. Meadows, glad to have you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the interest of time, I will try to be brief, but I do look forward to any questions or discussion that you may have. I'll quickly run through my testimony and make every effort not to be repetitive. Majority Chairman Thomas, Minority Chairman Stiles, honorable members of the Pennsylvania House Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs, thank you for the invitation to speak with you today about the BYD. As noted, I am Jeremy Meadows, and I do lobby on transportation issues on your behalf in Washington, D.C. for the National Conference of State Legislatures. It's a pleasure to appear here before this committee. As you know, NCSL is your association. All 50 state legislatures are members, and we are proud to count all 7,400 elected legislators, as well as all of the 30,000 plus staff who helped you with your works as our members. NCSL was created in 1975 with 3 primary goals: to foster interstate communication and cooperation, to strengthen the capacity of state legislatures, and to lobby on behalf of state legislatures and states writ large in Washington, D.C. on, among other issues, state sovereignty. For NCSL to lobby on issues, state legislators from 3/4 of the states must agree on a position. You and your elected colleagues determine not just what NCSL's lobbying priorities should be, but what message you want us to deliver to Congress and the federal administration on your behalf. Since 2006, you have provided NCSL with clear guidance on Real ID, and even DHS credits your engagement for dramatically altering the Real ID final regulations. In my testimony, I would like to give you a brief history of Real ID, share with you some quick impressions of the final regulations, provide a snapshot of NCSL's work on Real ID and developments in Congress, and note what actions state legislatures took in 2007. But make no mistake, Real ID is not the only impetus for improving the security and reliability of state-issued identity credentials. States have been moving to improve systems and ID documents since even before September 11th. Indeed, the Department of Homeland Security recognizes in the Real ID final regulations that many states have made significant progress in improving the integrity of their licenses, and PennDOT just reported on many of the processes and practices in place here to ensure the security of Pennsylvania IDs. As was noted, the concept of identity documentation and security did first arrive in the September 11th Commission. Congress acted to realize the Commission's recommendation, and in December 2004, President George W. Bush signed into law the National Intelligence Reform Act of 2004. The law, among other things, required the U.S. Secretary of Transportation to establish a negotiated rulemaking process to establish minimum standards for state-issued driver's licenses and identification cards. The group assembled to undertake the negotiated rulemaking process, including state officials, privacy advocates, information technology experts, federal transportation and homeland security officials, and others, met once before the process was stopped by Real ID. Real ID mandates that states issue state driver's licenses and identification cards pursuant to federal minimum standards. If states do not comply, as has been noted, those driver's licenses will not be accepted for federal purposes, which includes boarding aircraft, entering federal buildings, entering nuclear power plants, and other purposes that could be determined by the Secretary of Homeland Security. The Real ID Act of 2005 sailed through Congress and landed on the President's desk without a hearing in either House as part of the Emergency Supplemental Appropriation for Defense, the Global War on Terror, and Tsunami Relief in 2005. It was signed into law on May 11, 2005. Nearly 3 years later, and just 120 days before the statutory implementation date, on January 2008, DHS did issue the final regulations to guide states' implementation.
The good news is that the final regulations seem to offer much more flexibility for states than was originally proposed in the draft regulations, which were issued on March 1, 2007, and document comments were accepted through May 8, 2007. Based on this flexibility, DHS has re-estimated the 10-year cost to states at just under $4 billion, down $10 billion from the original $14 billion estimate. In September of 2006, NCSL, the National Governors Association, and the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators estimated the 5-year cost of Real ID to be $11 billion. The final rules still require states to ensure that all applicants are legally in the country and to verify applicants' documents using electronic databases, some of which are still under development. States are required to store copies of these source documents and to make their Department of Motor Vehicle databases available to other states. States must conduct background checks on certain DMV staff and secure the facilities where licenses are produced and where information and materials are stored. So then what flexibility produces a $10 billion cost savings? The new rules are much less prescriptive, allowing states to develop their own security plans and to self-certify compliance with most of the requirements. Gone are the rigid prescriptions for the security features of the identification card itself. They're replaced by several options from which states can choose, and it sounds as if Pennsylvania is already using some of those standards. In addition, states are able to reissue driver's licenses over a 6-year period, starting with people born after 1964, putting them off toward the end of the process. The extension process has already been noted. The bad news is the cost. It remains a major concern, and money from Washington is barely a trickle. The administration and the Department of Homeland Security have never requested funding for state costs in the president's budgets. The Department of Homeland Security has authorized states to use state Homeland Security grant program funds for Real ID, but this money is largely already spoken for by other Homeland Security priorities in the states. Congress has appropriated only $90 million, million with an M, not billion with a B, since fiscal year 2006, leaving states to absorb the difference or pass on the cost to residents. NCSL's executive director has noted that these are federal standards and they deserve federal dollars. In terms of NCSL activity, I just want to give you a quick history of the policy that has governed our engagement with both the Congress and DHS. At the National Conference of State Legislatures annual meeting in Nashville in 2006, state legislators adopted a policy calling on Congress to fix and fund the Real ID by December 31 of 2007, or NCSL would call for the repeal of the act. The fixes needed were derived from the 2006 study conducted by NCSL, NGA, and AMBA to determine the anticipated costs. Some of the fixes included changes and more lenient timelines, measures that allow states to manage the lines at DMVs, as well as connectivity and verification system issues. And as I noted, that September 2006 report estimated the cost of $11 billion over 5 years. That's the funding of the policy. Before the close of the 109th Congress in December 2006, Senators Akaka and Sununu introduced legislation that would repeal Real ID and return to the negotiated rulemaking process that preceded it. When the 110th Congress dawned in 2007, Senators Akaka and Sununu were joined by Senators Leahy, Baucus, and Tester to reintroduce that repeal and replace legislation. Senator Akaka invited NCSL to testify before his Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Subcommittee on Oversight in March of 2007, and NCSL's president, Texas State Senator Leticia Vandefute, testified at that time. On the House side, Congressman Allen of Maine has introduced similar legislation that would repeal and replace. Senator Snowe of Maine introduced legislation to delay the implementation of the Real ID and require the Department to take into account the concerns and challenges associated with states' compliance when implementing the Real ID. Some other bills have been introduced suggesting more stringent means for encouraging states to comply with Real ID. There is some discussion that perhaps financial sanctions could be imposed by Congress. And there also has been legislative language that has attempted to expand the use of Real ID, perhaps requiring states to only accept Real IDs for voter ID purposes, or perhaps for applying for other social service benefits. Thus far, the only action taken in the 110th Congress has been to provide $50 million for state Real ID implementation costs. When the long-awaited draft regulations were issued in the spring of 2007, NCSL analyzed the regulations and provided state legislators with short 1 to 4 page briefs on various aspects, which were very prescriptive and inflexible. NCSL again joined with NGA and AMPA to submit joint comments, and NCSL has been testifying before state legislative committees and providing briefings on Real ID for the past couple of years. NCSL's fix and fund policy was renewed at the 2007 annual business meeting in Boston with additional language regarding privacy protections and specification that NCSL fixes and funding of at least $1 billion for state startup costs, at which point, if not received by December 31, 2007, NCSL will call for the repeal. In October 2007, DHS began to advise stakeholders, including state legislators, that the final regulations were imminent and that we would be relatively pleased with the outcome. In fact, Richard Barth, the Homeland Security Assistant Secretary for Policy Development, briefed NCSL's officers in October, recorded a podcast for the NCSL website, and spoke to NCSL's Fall Forum in Phoenix about the upcoming final regulations. At the Fall Forum in Phoenix, NCSL's fix and fund policy was further tweaked so that if the December 31, 2007 deadline was not met, NCSL would call for the repeal of Real ID and a return to the negotiated rulemaking process. Now that the final rules have been issued, NCSL is analyzing the rules and disseminating briefs. NCSL is also assessing the fixes that have been attained in the final regulations and how best to carry forward NCSL's lobbying policy. You can access all of this information and history on NCSL's website. Now, looking quickly at state activity. In 2007, 44 states considered approximately 145 bills or resolutions related to Real ID. Legislation passed in 25 states. 21 states passed measures that either prohibited state compliance with the Act or urged Congress to amend or repeal it. Maine, Montana, New Hampshire, Oklahoma, South Carolina, and Washington are the states that we attribute with having passed laws that strictly prohibit the state agencies from complying with Real ID. The Idaho legislature appropriated $0 for its implementation in 2008, effectively also not complying, and legislative chambers in 15 states passed resolutions or memorials that urged Congress to amend or repeal Real ID, or indicated the state's intent not to comply. Georgia lawmakers authorized the governor to delay implementation unless certain conditions were met, including financial. Only Indiana and Nevada expressly decided to bring their states closer to compliance, though the Ohio General Assembly directed the Ohio Department of Public Safety to request an extension for Real ID, and Tennessee appropriated funds for Real ID implementation. So far this year, 11 bills have been introduced in 8 states regarding Real ID. Several move states toward compliance, while others prohibit compliance. Notably, Pennsylvania Senate Bill 1220, Senator Mike Fulmer's Senate companion to Representative Rohrer's House bill. DHS has indicated that requesting the first of the 2 possible deadline extensions does not require states to commit to implementing Real ID, so many states have requested that first extension, but the states that acted to opt out last year show no signs of reversing their position. How states will react to the final rules and the remaining DHS estimated price tag of $4 billion remains to be seen. In closing, NCSL's policy process will continue to determine NCSL's posture on Real ID, and I encourage you to be involved in that process so that your and Pennsylvania's interests are factored into the debate. NCSL will continue to monitor state reaction and developments on Capitol Hill or within DHS, and we look forward to remaining a resource to you as you consider Pennsylvania's best course of action. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear, and I do look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Meadows. Representative Stosh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one question. In terms of do you have any advance information in terms of the issued regulations and states that had previously decided they would not participate? Is there any reconsideration going on in now that the final regulations have been issued?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The discussions that we've had, informal of course as they are, with the states that opted not to comply last year indicates that there is not strong impetus to reconsider. But of course, everybody is still analyzing the regulations and determining how many fixes have actually made it a more palatable process.
And then the last question is, NCSL's policy, which was adopted last year, is, I think it's a 1-year policy, so that'll be considered again at the annual meeting this year?
if not sooner.
If not sooner, okay. Now, when does it actually expire?
Technically, the resolution adopted at the Fall Forum last November will expire as of the July annual meeting.
Thank you.
Representative Melton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not to create an adversarial relationship or forum, but just, Mr. Williams, just if you get a moment, and I realize you probably can't do it on the spot, but I mean, just for our intellectual edification up here, I'd be curious if you could give us any feedback, comments, or thoughts about the position and testimony of NCSL, and also is it compatible with your understanding of where this issue is headed and some of the implications thereof?
Well, I'd say that before talking about the testimony, we at DHS have been working very closely with NCSL and NGA as well as ANWR over the past year. We've met on several occasions, we've testified together. So I think we've got a very cordial relationship. I think we exchange information quite often. So the testimony that I've seen in here, I would suggest it seems consistent with what I've seen before from NCSL. I don't perceive it to be having any disparaging remarks about DHS or the implementation of Real ID, and not saying that we agree with every specific line item identified, but I'd say to the extent that I've read and understand the information in here, that is consistent with their position. Really, I don't have any disparaging thoughts about the NCSL information, if that's what you're asking.
Certainly, and not quite in the sense of judging his testimony as a person or anything of that nature, but certainly I think it would help us if we could get to the heart of where there may be some differences in interpretation or perception between NCSL and DHS. If you have any factual basis there or just any different information that you maybe are interpreting differently and how NCSL is seeing this issue. I think it would just help us kind of sort out the federal state perspectives on this.
Yeah, I think there's really two key things, and I think we're consistent in our thoughts on these two key things. The terms that NCSL uses is fix and fund. Funding for, of course, I'll have to put on my DHS hat on in regards to funding, and of course DHS can not necessarily solicit funds from Congress. But funding, I think, would be, the states chose to ask for additional funding through their various representatives. That certainly wouldn't have any issues with that, and I think would be a good thing. On the fixed part, I'm not sure if I'd say we fix Real ID exclusively based upon NCSL comments, but I think when you take a look at the total 21,000 comments offered for the rule, NCSL, NGA, and the states, a number of other organizations, I think that we fixed Real ID to make it a more implementable document for each of the states in regards to their processes, but also ensuring that they've got a more secure driver's license card. So I think on the fixed part, I wouldn't use that term, but I would say that I think NCSL thinks that we've gone a long way in fixing it per what they suggest should be incorporated. On the funding part, would, again, additional money be nice? I think that'd be good. We've got $40 million originally appropriated, an additional $50 million in the omnibus that will certainly make available as a part of grants to states as well. And then I think the other thing that NCSL, and I don't know if they explicitly brought it out this time, they were also concerned about the verification systems, and we're certainly working hard to try to have those systems up and running somewhere near the summer, fall 2009 timeframe. So I think we've got agreements in regards to some of the things that could have been done early on better with Real ID, and I think we at DHS have certainly If you take a look at the ask and that bill for the 1.2 billion, I think it shows that DHS did lean forward to try to come up with additional funds to implement Real ID. And again, that's just one example that I can openly speak about, only because that bill's a part of public health.
Sure, and I can appreciate that. But just going forward, is that the official position of DHS, that it is incumbent upon the states to go back through their elected representatives to request any additional appropriations? DHS itself is not going to get involved in that part of this program.
I'd say the official position for states would be up to the states to decide what they think is best for the states. I don't believe that we at DHS would officially state what states should do, what actions states should take.
No, I understand that, but is DHS itself, at some point in the future, going to directly ask Congress, make a appropriation request that this program needs additional funding for it to realistically be implemented?
Again, I think our position has been that from an official perspective, DHS could not solicit funds from Congress.
I know it did not, but will it? Is there any type of plan, thought in that direction?
I think you pressed me on this one. But a clear example is, I'll refer back
I
to
don't
the
mean
immigration bill.
here that I'm trying to harass you in any way, but this is really an important question. It makes a great deal difference in the strategy that states can then pursue in terms of this matter.
But again, if you look at a past action that DHS has taken, and I refer back to the immigration bill where we asked for $1.2 billion, I think that shows DHS clear intent. Whether or not you're asking for the future, DHS will attempt to align funds as it did in the immigration bill last summer, then that's something I clearly cannot answer. I can only indicate that if you look at our past as an example of what we might choose to do or care to do in the future, the example of the past says we did ask for $1.2 billion for Real ID implementation.
I'd appreciate if, when you return to Washington, if Secretary Chertoff could be asked in effect this question, we could get some kind of correspondence from him to this committee about how he envisions this appropriation strategy / process moving in the future. I think that certainly would be very helpful.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Again, let me thank our guests. You make this possible. And let me just kind of close with sharing a few things with you. One, this is not the end, only the beginning. We're going to do all that we can to make sure that Pennsylvanians and government officials are aware of Real ID, its impact, and what we can do to move forward. As your representative on the executive committee of NCSL, and Jeremy Meadows works extremely hard. At some point, we would like to see maybe a memorandum of understanding between NCSL and Homeland Security, which speaks to some minimum standards that we believe that the federal government must respect about the residents of Pennsylvania and about residents throughout this great United States. Thirdly, we will be in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Scranton, and Erie. If you have any friends or know of any people, please let us know. Next, we have a very good analysis of Real ID as articulated through the regulations in your package. And I want to personally thank Allison Acevedo, Esquire, from office for doing that analysis. Thank you. Did an excellent job. And last but not least, I'm sure the minority chairman will support this. Cooperation, communications, collaboration, and compassion needs to be the hallmark of compliance and or non-compliance. Pennsylvania has not gone on record as compliant. They requested an extension. That first extension was an extension of grace that did not require an acknowledgement of compliance. So please don't leave this hearing saying that Pennsylvania has signed on. Pennsylvania has not signed on to the Real ID Act, and at some point we will be taking a position, hopefully collectively, but we will be taking a position. The legislature cannot start Real ID implementation. That is the executive branch that has that responsibility. The legislature can set conditions under which implementation should occur, and the legislature can decide not to comply. And we have made it very clear that if that's the direction that Pennsylvania wants to go, then we have an added responsibility to make sure that Pennsylvanians are aware of what that means. There's nothing in the act which says you have to do ABC, but there is something in the act which says that if you decide not to comply, you have an added responsibility to let Pennsylvanians know the consequences of non-compliance. So that door is open. Mr. Chairman, would you like to say a few things in closing?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think you summed it up very well. I just want to say that for all of us, this is a learning process also. In order to be a legislator, and to represent the people who we represent, we must know both sides of the issue. And we must hear from all the people, and that's what this process is. We will not be making decisions on this until that is complete, so that everyone has the opportunity to contribute their comments, whether they're for or against. But then we will have to make a decision as to the direction we believe this state should go, and that will certainly be occurring, I'm very hopeful, by late summer, early fall. Thank you.
Thank you.